So we've talked a lot over the last few weeks about the Rebel Navy and the Rebel Alliance as we lead up to Andor, and today I want to discuss sort of a big question that comes with the Rebel Navy. Where did they get these ships? So today let's discuss these sources of the Rebel Navy vessels, because they're different from nearly every other faction. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So, the Rebel Navy is vastly different from nearly every other Navy in Star Wars history. It had to source its ships from somewhere other than just contracting shipyards to build them. In most cases, they couldn't just go to major shipyards and go, hey, we're a rebellion against the current reigning government, can you supply us with warships? Because most major manufacturers would at best tell them to go away, and at worst report them to the Empire. So they had to source their ships from elsewhere. So that brings up the question, where did the Rebel Alliance get their navy from? And today we're going to explore some of the avenues that led ships to the Alliance to restore the Republic. So, in the early days, most Rebel forces consisted of just small starfighter squadrons and light freighters. These light freighters would have been owned by civilian pilots who maybe had some allegiance to the Rebel Alliance, or sided with the rebellion during an argument and ended up getting sort of sucked into the Rebel Alliance and becoming part of that organization. As for the fighters, it's different for nearly every fighter, but a lot of them were fighters that were designed and manufactured for the Empire, but ultimately rejected by that much larger faction, discarded, and then scooped up by the Alliance. Something you'll see a lot. They use a lot of equipment that was rejected by the Empire for being usually too expensive to manufacture. But as time rolled on and the Alliance got more and more notable, they started to get larger ships. At first, they were heavier and heavier freighters. Pirate factions may throw their hat in the ring and donate pirate ships to be used as light warships. And then we get things like the CR-90 corvettes, the Corellian corvettes that would form a crucial part of Rebel strategy, particularly in the early days. And a lot of those were prevalent as diplomatic cruisers, which would be donated by worlds that were sympathetic to the Rebel Alliance cause. But they couldn't just be handed over to the rebellion, as many of these worlds were still technically Imperial loyal worlds, so they had to get a little bit creative. That's how we get situations like what we see with the Hammerhead corvettes on Lothal, where they are stolen by Rebel agents after they were put out in the open and left unguarded by Alderaanian officials. This is a fairly common occurrence. A planet loyal to the rebellion, but still technically under the umbrella of the Empire, makes their equipment remarkably easy to steal and invites the rebels to come in and just yoink a few ships before the Empire can actually respond. This resulted in a lot of smaller diplomatic vessels like the CR-90 and the Hammerhead ending up in service for the Rebel Alliance, a role that they filled pretty well because they were light, fast transport/warships, which were perfect for engaging Imperial forces in hit-and-run tactics. But when you get to the larger ships, things get a little bit more complicated. Let's talk about the Nebulon Bs. Nebulon Bs formed more or less the backbone of the Rebel Navy in a combat sense in the early days of the Rebel Alliance. They often served as flagships and were often the largest ships in those fleets. So where did these come from? Well, like many other vessels in the Rebel Navy, they were originally built for the Empire, but ultimately discarded because they didn't fit the Tarkin Doctrine or the mentality that the Empire was trying to pursue. In the case of the Nebulon B, we don't know for sure, but it seems pretty likely that the Nebulon B simply lost out in a contract to the Architans-class light cruiser, a ship of about the same size, but a much more Imperial design aesthetic and something that had already been established. As such, the Nebulon Bs that were manufactured were likely abandoned or sold to private parties who would eventually hand them off to the Rebel Alliance as they became fed up with the Empire. Outside of that, there was the occasional vessel that was openly stolen from the Empire, things like the Quasar Fire class carrier we see used by Phoenix Cell during and before the Battle of Atollon. This, however, is incredibly rare. At least in the early days, the Rebellion wasn't stealing a lot of Imperial vessels, as that would require an unusual amount of manpower that the rebels simply couldn't spare. But as the rebellion really started to pick up steam and whole systems started to leave the Empire to join the rebellion, that's when the Navy really started to pick up extra forces. The most notable example here is Mon Calamari, which donated not just their massive existing fleet of skyscraper/starships, but their construction capabilities to newly constructed Rebel shipyards that the now more economically capable Rebel Alliance could start using to manufacture vessels like every other faction in galactic history. By that point, the war between the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire is becoming a little bit more even, with larger and larger Rebel fleets and larger Rebel ships in these engagements, especially with the increasing prevalence of Mon Calamari warships, which would only become more and more common after the Battle of Yavin, all the way up until the Battle of Endor, when the Rebel fleet was led by several Mon Calamari cruisers. So the Rebel Alliance, unlike every other faction in galactic history, did have to kind of snowball their forces, starting with small ships that had been donated by pirates or privately owned ships, and then being able to receive ships from governments that were less than pleased with the Galactic Empire, and eventually make their way up to manufacturing their own capital ships with the Mon Calamari, who had seceded from the Empire, more or less. And it's interesting because each ship in the Rebel Navy would sort of enter at a different time and have a different role. And if you'd like to learn about a ship that often served as the backbone of Rebel fleets, especially in those early days, I'll leave a link up here to my video on the Nebulon B class frigates, which served as sort of early Rebel flagships and were often some of the most capable warships in early Rebel fleets. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments, if you were the Empire and trying to sever the Rebellion's access to these ships, what would you do? How would you try to prevent small Rebel factions or a larger Rebel movement from gaining access to significant classes of warship? Would you try to regulate weapons on vehicles and vessels across the galaxy, or would you maybe try to install government-issued trackers on every starship? What do you have in mind? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.